He was humiliated, his documents torn up and thrown into a cell, unaware that he was standing before a Supreme Court judge. This incident exposed the rotten roots of the system and turned the lives of everyone involved upside down. What happened next will surprise even the most seasoned. But let's start from the very beginning. Early morning. Edward Scott, a 72-year-old man, was leisurely walking to a small cafe to enjoy his usual cup of coffee. Dressed in an elegant yet understated suit, he appeared to be just another pensioner. At the corner of the street, near an empty intersection, he noticed the red light, but seeing that the road was clear, he decided to cross. A patrol car suddenly stopped at the curb, and a young officer, Richard Green, jumped out. "Hey, you! Stop!" he shouted loudly, clearly irritated. Edward turned, trying to explain calmly. "Good morning, officer. I'm just—" Green interrupted him. "No excuses. Documents, now." Edward handed over his ID. The officer snatched it from him and glanced at it briefly. "These fake things won't fool anyone," he sneered, dramatically ripping the ID in half. "Officer, I'm sure this is a misunderstanding," Edward tried to say calmly, but Green had already made up his mind. "I'm tired of people like you. Think you can do whatever you want, huh? Get ready for an arrest," he said, calling for backup over the radio. As Edward waited aside, passers-by began to stop, watching the scene with interest. One witness pulled out a phone and started filming. Edward stood motionless, displaying an uncommon calm. "You don't understand who you're dealing with," Edward finally said, staring directly into the officer's eyes. Green smirked. "Oh, I understand all right, and I've dealt with plenty of people like you." A few minutes later, another police car arrived, and Edward was placed in the back seat without explanation. The car drove off, leaving the onlookers confused. One of them quietly remarked, "I don't know who that man is, but something tells me that officer is going to regret his actions." At the police station, Officer Richard Green brought Edward Scott through the main entrance. A sarcastic smile never left his face. "Write this down. Illegal jaywalking, resisting arrest, suspicion of document forgery," he loudly declared to the duty officer so everyone could hear. Edward was escorted into an interrogation room and left alone. He remained calm, quietly observing the situation. Meanwhile, Green was in the next room, recounting to his colleagues how he had captured the brazen old man. "I'll show everyone that no one is above the law," he said, clearly enjoying the attention. But within an hour, chaos began to unfold at the station. Deputy Sheriff Roberts, flipping through papers, came across the name of the detainee. His face tensed immediately. "Edward Scott?" he asked the duty officer. The officer nodded. Roberts quickly stood up from his desk and walked over to Green. "Do you even know who you arrested?" he asked sharply, throwing a printout onto the table. Green stared at the text in surprise. "Is he someone important?" he mumbled. "This is a Supreme Court judge, the man who personally helped create the laws you're working under right now." Roberts's voice was tense. Green turned pale, realizing that his triumphant victory had turned into a disaster. Meanwhile, the video of the arrest, filmed by a witness, was quickly spreading on social media. Comments from users were filled with outrage. "How could they treat an elderly man like this?" some wrote. Others quickly recognized the judge and exclaimed, "That's Edward Scott. He deserves respect." The station began receiving calls, first from journalists, then from lawyers and representatives of the Supreme Court. Each new call only increased the panic within the station. Roberts, realizing that the situation was spiraling out of control, entered the interrogation room and released Edward. "I offer my deepest apologies, sir," Roberts said, but Edward, maintaining his composure, simply asked, "Who is responsible for the actions of this officer?" Roberts sighed heavily. "We'll sort it out," he promised. As Edward left the station, journalists were already waiting for him at the exit, but he merely raised his hand, calmly saying, "I'll speak later. Right now, I need some time." Meanwhile, inside the station, Green, stunned by the consequences, stood in the corner, not knowing that his career might be over. By the next morning, The name Edward Scott was on everyone's lips across the country. The media had picked up the story, headlining it. Police officer harasses elderly black man, unaware he's a Supreme Court justice. The video from the scene went viral, and viewers' comments were filled with outrage. People were demanding answers. How could this have happened? Meanwhile, Green had locked himself in his office, watching the news. His phone was ringing non-stop, but he refused to answer. His superiors had summoned him for an emergency meeting. In the sheriff's office, Green was told bluntly, "Your actions have jeopardized the entire department's reputation. You must issue a public apology and explanation." Green merely nodded, unable to argue. At the same time, Edward was in his office, working on a statement for the press. He knew that this story was about more than just him. It was about a systemic issue. When his colleague, Senator Thompson, called, he simply replied, "This isn't about me. It's about those who don't have my protection." By noon, a crowd had gathered at the city hall. Green stood before the reporters, trying to appear confident. "I apologize for my actions, which may have been perceived as excessive," he said, but his words only sparked discontent. These weren't apologies. They were a formality. Edward also attended the press conference. His arrival silenced the room. He walked up to the stage and cast a glance at Green, who looked away. "I'm not here to accuse any one person," Scott began. "I'm here to remind everyone that the system that is supposed to protect us sometimes destroys. We cannot let bias govern the law." His words were met with applause, and reports of the conference spread like wildfire. One journalist asked him, "Judge Scott, what do you want to see change?" He responded firmly, "I want to see a police department that works for justice, not fear." After this statement, Sheriff Roberts approached Edward. "Sir, I'm ready to cooperate. Tell me what needs to be done," he said. Edward simply nodded. "Start with training. Your officers need to understand that power is a responsibility, not a privilege." By evening, the news had covered all the events of the day. Meanwhile, Green sat in his apartment, watching the TV screen where his face had become a symbol of the system's failure. For the first time, he felt the weight of his own mistakes. A few days after the press conference, the police department announced a mandatory retraining program for all officers, including courses on combating bias. Sheriff Roberts stated, "We acknowledge the problem and are ready to work on its resolution." However, this did not mean that Green would escape punishment. Green was called to an internal commission. He was charged with abuse of power and undermining public trust. "Your actions have called into question not only your competence, but also our ability to protect the citizens," said the commission chair. Green tried to justify himself. "I didn't know who he was. It was a mistake." But his words fell flat. As a result, he was temporarily suspended from duty until the investigation was concluded. Meanwhile, Edward Scott did not leave the matter unfinished. He organized a series of meetings with police representatives, lawyers, and community activists. At these sessions, reforms were discussed that could help reduce bias within the police force. His voice became a symbol of change, and public involvement gave the movement a powerful boost. At one of these meetings, Edward said, "This is not my personal struggle. This is the fight for everyone who has ever felt powerless before the system. We must push for change." His words sparked a wave of support, and even those who had previously been skeptical of reforms began to listen. At the same time, Green, on forced leave, tried to make sense of his actions. He watched the news, where stories of other people suffering from injustice were being shared. He began to understand. The problem was bigger than he had imagined. Under public pressure, he decided to write an open letter in which he admitted his mistakes. "I was part of the problem, and I am ready to be part of the solution," he concluded his message. The final note came with a citywide forum where Edward spoke before thousands of people. "We must remember that each of us is a part of this system. Change doesn't start from the top down, it starts with us. Let's make justice the rule, not the exception." The story concluded not only with the punishment of those responsible, but also with the beginning of long-awaited changes. Green, after undergoing training, volunteered in a program that taught new officers the principles of equality. Edward, on the other hand, continued his fight, becoming a symbol not only of the law's power, but also of the power of justice. This story reminded everyone change is possible if we fight for it.